One word that you love the most.
um, Kale,
One word that you dislike the most.
onions.
Let's just assume here that food security was completely out the window and we needed to start a project ASAP. Everybody in your flat needs to chip in. How would you arrange them to go, okay, look, we need to grow everything on our own, if not, we're all going to die?
So let's say you have a block of flats that has, let's say, 15 floors, right? The
Mhm.
first 4 to 5 floors should be growing things like sweet potatoes, cassava, and some rice. You can grow rice in Singapore. And then I've
Why
seen,
first 5 floors?
so as you have to ration the rest of the building, right? That's probably the cookiest interview I've done.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Edric, Poon and Company, the podcast where anybody can inspire everybody. I'm Edric, and this week we've got Jolene Lum, the CEO and founder of Urban Tiller Singapore. Urban Tiller is a farm-to-table AgriTech startup delivering fresh vegetables to urban households within 6 to 8 hours from harvest. They source produce that is grown hydroponically, organically, and in an environmentally sustainable way. In short, it's all about bringing you fresh, safe, and sustainable produce. We invited Jolene onto the podcast to dive deeper into sharing the joys of fresh fruit startups, discovering her why, and misconceptions on this thing we call sustainable produce. So let's get on to the podcast. Hey,
Hi.
hi, Jolene.
Hi, Edric. Thanks for having me.
No problem, no problem. Thanks again for taking time off this afternoon to do it. I know you have a very, very busy schedule. In one of the other podcasts that I caught you on, you were running around every day, checking in with all the farms, so on and so forth, and your entire day is just filled with activity.
I think everyone who's running their own business, starting up, it's part of the thrill and part of what you remember, right?
Earlier on in the intro, I was actually mentioning that we do want to really tackle this whole thing about understanding or clearing up the misunderstanding of sustainable produce. But more importantly, maybe you'd like to be able to also share a little bit more about what Urban Tiller Singapore is all about and how everybody, right, can start supporting local a little bit more through Urban Tiller.
Of course, I think this is, a long story, and there's so many elements to our food supply chain, and it's not easy to understand for the average consumer who, in their experience, goes to the wet market, goes to the supermarket, and interacts with food as and when sort of it's available on the shelf, right? And I think for a lot of us living in Singapore, that's usually the case. We don't get to ask further questions beyond what we see on the supermarket shelves. So I think Urban Tiller really brought in a new element of thinking about where your food comes from, how do you be connected to your producers, and understanding what sort of traceability is, and how that factors into sustainability as well. So where would you like me to start?
Well, first off, let's maybe clear the air. Urban Tiller is not considered a grocer, right?
No, so I don't actually run my own farm, but the story is that we do have the expertise of setting up farms. We actually have another operation in Hyderabad, India. So Singapore, we started in September 2020. In Hyderabad, India, we actually partnered up with some of our friends and colleagues who actually are running a farm, and they've already been running about 7 to 9 acres of farmland for the last 3 to 4 years. So there's a lot of expertise in growing, a lot of expertise in sort of ag tech, and knowing how to grow things sustainably in different settings as well. The hope was always to start a farm in every city that Urban Tiller was in. So it's on the horizon in Singapore, but I think we started here without setting up a farm because the time we started really dovetailed and coincided with an abundance and proliferation of other farms in Singapore because of the government push for local food security, and food
Mm.
production in Singapore as well. So it became a very good way for us to start and say, hey, could we just test this value proposition of freshness, and see if we could source from the local farms and really bring something different to the consumers here?
Okay. And when we talk about the pilot over at Hyderabad itself, now I really like to understand when you partner up all the farms over in Singapore, right? How does the pilot story actually tell the farmers here in Singapore that come on to the platform, let Urban Tiller assist you here?
So I think the pilot program is not so much we didn't intend for it to be a pilot. I think my business partner and I really wanted to learn how to farm, and actually it predates me. It predates before I joined and built the product for Urban Tiller. Urban Tiller in India really started out as a farm. Like we wanted to learn how to farm, how to grow things, grow a wide assortment of things, and then figure out, like how does the business model for a farm actually work. And urban or peri-urban farming is something that's come up in the last 10 to 15 years very, very strongly. And I think there's a lot of potential for us to maximize efficiency while doing things sustainably and feeding, a continent that really will have a lot of mouths to feed in a very short while. So in Singapore, I think when I partner up with the farms, there are a few criteria that I have to look at when it comes to the ability to provide that freshness. And this is something that you learn along the way, because in the traditional model of how farms interact with their buyers, they may not need to harvest every day. So if you supply to a supermarket, maybe there's a weekly or twice a week offtake, so you harvest when you need to. And in that sense, in the supermarket, they have a warehousing model. Maybe you pass it to a middle person, another distributor, who then sort of decides who it's going to. So freshness is not always part of that equation, and farmers don't worry about that as much, as long as sort of like they harvest the produce and send it to whoever they need to by whenever they need to. So I think what really happened in Singapore was there was a small shift. I think there was a shift in how the farmers were working with us. Some of them had to, rework their sort of time schedule because they had to harvest every morning now for all the days that we deliver. And also understand a little bit more about the arrangement with us, right? Because so traditionally you would imagine that farms growing their own produce would sort of have a harvest and then sort of figure out who to sell it to, supermarkets. And a lot of these models actually work on what I would like to call consignment, right? It's well understood that, okay, if you're a farmer and bringing your produce to the farmer's market, in any context, you would go to the farmer's market and hope that you sell out. But what happens if you bring all your produce there and it doesn't sell out, right? What do you do with it? Especially with super fresh produce, if it's leafy greens, it goes to waste, right? Because it's not as fresh when you want to keep it to sell it the next day. It's just not the same quality. So with supermarkets, that's also the story, right? Consignment models are when you might need to supply 10 to 50 kilograms or more, and you only get paid for what actually gets sold. So I think there's a lot of waste that happens. There's a lot of sort of uncertainty for the farmers. And what Urban Tiller does is we buy sort of the vegetables as an offtake agreement. I can take it from the farmers and I can say that, hey, you don't have to worry about the selling. You don't have to worry about the distribution. I'll do that part for you so that you can focus on really thinking about growing the assortment, growing the kinds of food that we have, and more sustainable ways of doing things as well.
Mm. Okay, you mentioned the harvest period and also the delivery down to the end consumer directly. What's that time frame that we actually get?
Yeah, so actually, when was the last time you thought about that? When you went to a supermarket, did you ever ask yourself that question?
Well, I've been asking myself that for a while, and I always wonder to myself, how come the vegetables, especially, are starting to wilt in a day or
Mhm.
two? There should be a lot
Yeah.
more life in them, so it makes me wonder.
Yeah. For sure. So, in fact, for produce that you see in the supermarkets, they could have been harvested anywhere between 2 to 14 days before they even get to the supermarket shelves. And it's well known that certain producers or distributors along the way also spray some coatings on your vegetables to make them stay fresher. And this is an artificially induced process, right? And that's because international supply chains are that long. And sometimes it goes through so many middle people, so many distributors before it actually gets to a retail store. And on top of that, I think one of the central Urban Tiller concerns is that up to 40 to 70% of food waste actually happens along the supply chain before it actually even arrives to the consumer. Be it sort of like human damage, packaging ruptures, everything that happens along the supply chain needs to buffer for that perfect piece of produce that you see on the supermarket shelves. So there's actually a lot of waste that goes in, that is generated as a result of these international supply chains. And Singapore, given that we import more than 90% of our food, that's proportionately a lot of produce that goes to waste and a lot of food that goes to waste.
On your end, I mean, you've done many things. You have okay. First off, you speak German and Italian, right? Uh, you study history, if I'm not wrong.
No,
You
I,
are
I graduated with a degree in chemistry and literature.
chemistry and literature.
Yeah.
You're also Red Cross trained as a paramedic.
Yeah, when I was studying abroad, yes.
Oh, yeah. So let me ask you something. Out of all these things, then all of a sudden you wake up saying, hey, I think I'm going to like, get involved with farming. How does that happen?
No, I think it didn't. It definitely didn't happen in the way that I just woke up and decided to do this. There was a very very slow and gradual process, and it was unexpected. In fact, I don't think I would have ended up in this industry if not for COVID. Um, so I had a job. I was doing regional sales and recruitment for a company in the field of corporate education, and then sort of like I had a very keen interest in sustainability. I still had an interest in education, and lo and behold, like a lot of young people who are unhappy with their jobs, I quit my job, and
Mm,
then it was right during COVID. It was the height of COVID when it was about to hit. So by the time I finished serving my notice, my plans to sort of explore this new field of sustainability plans came to a halt. And what I found myself doing was I was a assistant special needs teacher for a short while. And I think that
mm,
was a period in time where, there were so many uncertainties because of COVID, because of the pandemic, but also personal uncertainty in terms of where this was going to lead me. But ultimately, that period was very, very humbling for me because, given all the opportunities that I've had and people that I've met, that period of time working with students with special needs, working with teachers who had been in the special needs sector for a long time, I think it taught me the value of patience and thinking about human potential and how much time you actually needed to put in to something like that. And I think it really recalibrated my goals in life and how I wanted to approach work in my career. So shortly after that, I actually joined another education startup as co-founder. And what that education startup was planning to do was we realized that there was a huge gap between what young people thought of sustainability and wanting to do good, which is a position I found myself in, versus what we were learning in school. So I think there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of good education going on about sustainability, but for most of us who graduate with a degree and want to come out to do good work, there was a gap in how that could actually be done. So with my education startup, what we were doing was thinking about how can we connect real world industries with young people, people mid-career, and thinking about how they could get a glimpse into the real work that was happening, be it with social impact, sustainability, and CSR, usually a combination of that. When
mm.
I joined in 2020, early on, we were focusing on, of course, food security because it was a huge topic when the pandemic started, lockdown started, and people were panic buying. So I think that was a good moment that we decided, let's have a conversation about food. Let's have a conversation about where our food comes from, and how do we reconcile where food is coming from in a city like Singapore, and what were the opportunities given that the topic was coming up more and more in the news. So I definitely didn't just wake up into the industry, right? I was spending a lot of time, when we were in that startup. We were organizing a series of programs and reaching out to industry players, including food tech VCs, VCs themselves, startups, farmers, agribusiness, and people who were in the space for a long time. And fortunately, because we were an education startup, the connections that I made, they all had a lot of goodwill when it came to sharing their expertise and really coming to explain some challenges and opportunities in the industry as well. So that was a good 4 to 6 months of really understanding the food value chain and the supply chain in Singapore. I wouldn't say it was a very long time, but it got me very interested in some of the central questions. And I met my business partner in that period and decided to come on board and be with this idea, sit with it, and really try to build it up. So I met my business partner who actually the two of us are part of Renergy. It's a venture studio that works on innovation and using circular economy principles. We build food, feed, and agri-tech startups. So it's really an ecosystem that we have built. And Urban Tiller is one of them. And it's, of course, my biggest baby. It's my biggest child. So in that sense, I'm very, very excited about the work that we do. And I think there's so much opportunity in Singapore right now for thinking about sustainability, thinking about circular economy, about food, about agri-tech. even though there's no real pathway for someone who's grown up in Singapore to enter the industry, right? We don't have a very well known agricultural degree or pathway. So I think it's also at the same time an industry that requires so much multidisciplinary sort of like approach, and problem solving and innovation. So yeah, I feel very lucky and very grateful to have stumbled into this place.
Yeah, it is really cool because what you've done, I mean, on the back end, right? It sounds like it's one of those stories that, okay, we'll learn the ropes, we'll get this done, but there has to be something that draws you to this, you know. So
Mm.
my question to you is, if Urban Tiller has the value proposition of fresh, safe, and sustainable, right?
Mm.
But in your own words, what does Urban Tiller and Jolene Lum stand for?
I think a lot of it is trying new things. It's really sort of a matter of innovating around a problem that seems so big and so difficult, and trying in a very small way to see if you can push the boundaries when it comes to doing something different and creating real value. I think it's very easy to find yourself in a position where, okay, like you can buy something, sell something, trade something, create monetary value, but I think a lot of it was experiences, right? When I started talking to farmers and people in this industry, one of the first things about food is that it's such an intimate and personal experience. And when I was tasting food on the farms right off the plants, that was something that changed me. I was like, this is an experience that I want to share with someone else. You can't quite buy it off the shelves. Is that an option? Is this something valuable enough that someone else might appreciate it, and it might actually sort of radically change how we understand food and our relationship with food in a city. But ultimately, it comes from, okay, how do I share that joy and that magic of someone tasting something that is, freshly harvested?
One of the things that I noticed that Urban Tiller does is that you're also providing options, new products such as your pestos, and even there's a spicy pistachio
Hot
based
sauce, yeah, there's
yeah, sauce.
pesto, hot sauce.
Mm,
Yeah.
so all these, are these your own creations?
So I think what we were looking for was a unifying theme that would make people excited. And what we identified when we started was, okay, Singaporeans and Asians in general love their spice, but there was a lack of curation. So I was like, could a spicy pesto be the beginning of sort of like storytelling around different kinds of chilies, and then sourcing those chilies and then sort of growing them here, making it fully local. I'm a hothead myself, and when it comes to sort of like looking for different levels of spice, and to tell a story around it.
I love what you guys are doing because, again, like what you said, storytelling, a lot of it is engaging a community and you're building it as you go along.
Yes.
Now you're also calling for others to also submit their recipes over to you via Instagram as well as email, right?
Yes, yes, of course. At the start, we were like, what if, when we were innovating on the business, right? Like, what if people just don't buy because they don't know how to use the vegetables, right? Especially when you have more niche products, things like ice plant or Swiss chard that you don't usually find in the supermarket. Finding nice recipes that would fit the palate that people would enjoy doing, or just showcasing how beautiful it can be. I think that's always a nice touch. And for that reason, we also maintain very, very close touch with our customers, finding out what we can do better and how we can value add, what kind of content they want to see, what kind of products they want to see as well.
Can you tell us one of the weirdest but yet the best, the nicest recipes you've probably found?
I remember there was a period of time when we first started selling kale. There were like 6 or 7 variations of kale chips, and I love it because turning vegetables into a snack. It's something that everyone can do. But then you realize that there were so many variations of how people tune the air fryer, how much oil they put, how they keep it crispy. So I really, really enjoyed that. Although there are some really cool recipes, check it out on the blog. But I really enjoyed the fact that so many people were getting on board the kale chips train. And there were so many ways to make kale chips. And they were like, oh, you should put this oil instead of that oil, so that it stays crispy. And how do you sort of prepare the air fryer in different ways so that you can minimize mess? Yeah, that was good fun.
Oh, okay. So it's like you get a lot of more information and in-depth kind of tips to finesse the whole thing.
100%, 100%. Even when it comes to like, sometimes we learn from our customers, like, they found a new way to, use parts of the vegetables that they previously didn't use. I remember, so we have an in-house chef who prepares the hot sauce and the pesto, right? And we realized that people like Swiss chard. They like the leaves, right? But the stems are quite hard to eat. So what he did one day was he pickled the stems. And he turned Swiss chard stems into these nice little pickles that can be had with different things as well. So I think that's that continuous having fun with it, and that's always part of the process.
Oh, very nice, very nice. I mean, even broccoli stems, right? They were actually wasted
100%.
quite a lot. We're always used to taking the florets and everything, but the broccoli stem can be eaten if you boil them and salt them nicely.
100%.
Everything's good. Yeah. So it's really cool that you have all this. So, ladies and gentlemen, whoever is listening out there or watching, head on down to Urban Tiller SG. Go check out the blog, get the recipes in, and if you got your own, also submit them. Okay, now moving forward, Jolene and I were planning this a little bit, and one of the things that we do want to tackle right now is this thing of sustainable farming and ultimately, right, how do you truly support local farms and produce? Is it really about something that we go down to the farm and actually buy them ourselves? Or do we just buy anything off our local grocers or supermarkets that said made in Singapore? Is that how you truly support the local farm and produce?
So that's a big question, and I like to think about that question from the point of view of how widely accessible is it, and how mainstream can it go, right? So going down to a farm is great, and like buying produce from there is great. Although a lot of the farms in Singapore may not be as bucolic as you imagine in your head, right? Like you can't just go down and it's an open farm. A lot of the farms that are licensed in Singapore, there are a lot of new farms that are actually inside buildings, and they look a lot more like a science lab or like a
Mm.
clean room than an open field where your kids can run around. In fact, you would probably not allowed to you're not allowed to run around because of all the equipment and things that are set up. It's great. I think going direct to a farm is great. But I think one of the things that we noticed about consumers is ultimately how do you make impact at scale, right? And how do you scale access to a lot of these farms and produce? So one of the things is that, yeah, like what you mentioned, right? It seems like a very good idea when it comes to let's go down to a farm and let's buy produce directly from them and support them. For the average consumer, if you think about a salad that you eat, right, that you get at any of your CBD salad joints, you might have lettuce, kale, like chard, cherry tomatoes, toppings, meat, everything. Could you get all of that from one farm? The answer is probably no. So when I was talking to a lot of people in the space, what became clear was that a lot of small to mid-sized farms, they usually specialize in 1 to 2 kinds of produce, maybe a maximum of 4 to 5. So the question for the consumer is, okay, am I willing to drive down or take public transport down to a farm and realize that the only thing I can buy from them is kale or is lettuce, right? There's always that urge that, okay, I can go to the farm and get this, but then I need to go to the supermarket anyway and go get everything else that is going to be on my dinner plate that day. And I think the central focus of Urban Tiller is, okay, there needs to be aggregation, because it doesn't make sense for a farm to, let's say, go directly to consumer and only have 1 or 2 products on offer. What our hope was to do was to make sure that these produce types could provide a full assortment of what people needed, and as a result become sustainable for the consumer and for us as a business. Because I think that's super important when it comes to thinking about what is the long-term sustainability of a business model like that, right? And which is why I like to think about sustainability not just in terms of, okay, not using a plastic bag, but really sort of like longevity of consumer choices, consumer lifestyles, and at the end of the day, sustainability of relationships that you have with people, right? If, let's say, there's a farm who's supplying to any supplier, and that kind of consistency is really the one thing that manages to keep a farm alive economically, and keeps them sustainable, right? There were I mean, when I started out, there were a few farms who I met, and there are some horror stories about how supermarkets can just overnight decide that they are not going to take a certain amount of produce the next day, but you've been growing it for 3 months for them, right? So then you have a whole bunch of stuff in your farm and your off-taker was not going to take it, what are you going to do with it, right? And creating it's financial loss, but it's also a loss of time and a waste of food. So I think what we are trying to do is also to focus on long-term consistent survivability of players like that as well. So, you going up to a farm is great. On that day, you buy, like 1 kilo, 2 kilos of vegetables, and then you don't come back for 2 months, right? What happens then? So I think it's always that consistency as well. And the second part of it is what I said just now about accessibility. You and I might be able to, let's say, drive down to a farm for a day and buy whatever we want. But not everyone can do that, right? For a lot of people, for reasons of time, money, accessibility, that's just not an option, right? There still needs to be something that's made accessible, that's made easy. And the truth is, a lot of local farms, there's a central question to why should we support a farm just because it's local, right? And that conversation extends. It's okay, I understand that eating as local as possible helps me reduce food waste along international supply chains and the carbon emissions of bringing something all the way from somewhere else. But also, okay, if it's grown in an urban farm, people have questions about, oh yeah, but it's growing in aircon and in lights. How is that more sustainable, right, than growing something out in an open field? Well, that takes debate. That takes sort of like a lot of understanding. So for us at Urban Tiller, a lot of the goals that we try to do is try to achieve up to 90% of water savings when it comes to water use compared to conventional agriculture, and making sure that in a controlled environment, you're actually able to keep your food cleaner and safer, because if you grow in a good controlled environment, you actually don't need pesticides. You don't need to spray excessive chemicals. You don't need to sort of clean the environment is kept clean for you in that sense, right? Of course, questions of things like, oh yeah, electricity for the lights, electricity for the aircon, electricity for, keeping everything clean. It's a balance, right? It's a balance of how are you going to feed billions of people by, the next 5 to 10 years, and what resource is more scarce, right? And that's generally a big question. So for us, there's an understanding that, okay, so there are certain things that have to change about how we produce our food. But then there's also the big question, right, of how much does it cost, right? So the truth is, some kinds of produce grown outdoors in the conventional way, like, whatever you might see in Cameron Highlands or an open farm, growing it indoors in an urban smart farming setting can cost up to 10 to 20 times more, which is a very dramatic change in cost of production. If you think about how much you pay as a consumer, right, and how much you're used to pay, willing to pay, can afford to pay. Do we need to pay that much for food? I think that's not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, what is the true cost of food? And in order to be sustainable, is there a price that we also have to pay? And how do we mitigate that, or how do we sort of make it more amenable and more sustainable to really achieve certain outcomes that justify a certain cost?
It's really a misconception to some extent, right? We do, as much as possible, want to always advocate, sustainable, organic. But what exactly is the definition of sustainable and or organic? Sustainability for a large corporation is very different from sustainability to, a small farm, right? And likewise for organic.
Yeah, I think that's a big one. That's a big one because so you mentioned the word organic, right? Organic produce, it's actually a standard that only applies to things that are grown in soil. So organic farming actually specifically comes from a US standard that refers to soil that has been certified organic, which means that you have to leave it for 2-3 years, not spray anything at all, and there's like a certain checklist that you have to go through. So for new farms, even if you're a soil farm that's come up new, that's something that takes 2 to 3 years or even 4 years to even get an organic certification. Then you have organic methods of farming, which means, okay, not spraying this, not spraying that, and everything's as natural as it can be. And hydroponic farming, actually, there is an internal standard for what is organic, which means that you use fully organically sourced bionutrients. That comes with a different cost structure, right? But generally what happens with hydroponic farming is that if you are growing it well in a controlled environment, you naturally don't use pesticides, and you don't have to sort of get rid of pests, because in a clean room, ideally that should not happen. So it depends on your view on things like pesticides and things like that. My mother's generation, at least, they believe that having hydroponically grown vegetables will give you rheumatism, because it wasn't grown in the sun, it was grown in these water tubes, and then they were like, oh, it doesn't taste as good, it's not as nutritious. And right now, the truth is, we've been doing this for 10, 15 years. You decide what goes into your plants, so you can actually more accurately sort of predict and ensure that you are getting the nutrition that you would like in your vegetables. But there are a lot of these misconceptions, right, that need to be
Correct.
debunked. They're like, oh yeah, you know what? Artificial lighting will never give you the same kind of nutrients and magic that the soil and the sun will give you. Um, but then there's also the balance of like, oh yeah, but if it's grown in the sun, there's a lot of pesticides. Then some other aunties and uncles will tell you, I would rather eat the vegetables that the worms and the bugs are also eating, because that proves that it's organic. And then hydroponic produce, because there are no insects, right? So they'll be like, oh, how come the leaves are so nice? It's because they spray something on it, is it? And it's always this, push and pull between having to explain, having to educate, but also trying to please the customer, right? That's always something that comes up. So when you do opt to do this work, dealing directly with customers, that's something you sign up for, lah, right? So it's definitely something that's been an interesting journey. But I think the conversation is opening up. There's a mix of fascination, there's a mix of personal concern for the food that you're eating, but also I think so many of us as consumers are shielded from the larger conversations that happen on the level of, okay, how does industrial agriculture change the way that food is being done, right? Like the conversation on pesticides is one that we think about as a consumer, but think about it from the point of view from the farmer, right? There also needs to be a lot of education as to why there are still big crop protection companies who exist, and they exist for a very good reason. It's for the fact that, well, a lot of big farms do need crop protection and do need sort of some kind of pesticides to preserve the amount of food that's being saved, and to sort of create that level of food and nutrition for people, because otherwise it would all go to waste, right? Otherwise it would be ravaged by pests and things like that. So there's a very, very fine balance, and the whole food system is a very, very complex thing. So breaking it down is one thing. Creating a certain product for a certain segment is one thing. But also, I think the larger question is, how do we then move together towards something better for society as a whole, right? How do you make that option something mainstream? How do you make that option aspirational and affordable enough for most people to have?
Yeah, that's fantastic. At the end of the day, it's really down to the individual mindset, right? But not everybody will jump onto the bandwagon immediately about understanding what sustainability is or what it is to them, or whether or not they would prefer organic, or are they okay with saying, okay, I'll just wash off whatever pesticides there are with that soap, right? Again, right now, our mindsets, why we cannot say that, oh, we're gonna go immediately into this, is because we're still thinking about where does the vegetable grow from. It must have the soil, must have water, it must have nutrients, and it must have the sun. This is in the
Mhm.
textbooks from I don't know, God knows when. Okay, but we grew
Yeah.
up. I grew up in that era. And when hydroponics first came out, I was also wondering to myself, you mean you're growing vegetables and plants from pipes and water? Wait.
Yeah.
Aren't we missing sunlight and the soil? How is that not? Oh yeah, you have to add in chemical fertilizers, which are all in liquid format.
And it sounds scary when you say that you're
Yep,
adding in chemicals.
correct,
What you're
exactly.
adding in is nutrients. It's the same thing as fertilizers. Yeah.
Exactly. We talk about alternate proteins, for
Yeah.
example. Once we go down that rabbit hole, you also wonder, okay, so how does Impossible Meats do it, right? Why is
Oh
it that
yeah.
is it soy based? What are all the oils? How come this is cultured? Oh, you mean animal meat is grown in a lab now? How is that
Mm,
being done? So
mm,
all these things, it's somehow or other we have to break those barriers down
yeah.
and open up to understanding that the chemistry in the whole thing is it's okay. It's not something
Mm,
that will uh get us. But one question I do want to ask one of these days, if I can get someone in the new protein side, is if there is cultured meat in a lab,
yeah.
what about the natural immunities and the resistances that come by? I think this applies to what organic farming is about as well,
It's a
because
very interesting question. Yeah. So
yeah,
I mean, my business
where
partner and
does
I
the
also
immunity
have
come
a
from, right?
alternative protein. Yeah, we also have an alternative protein company, and I've done some work on it. And I think it's a very interesting conversation to have when it comes to what's going into the product and what is the upside for the consumer, right? So I think that's always a central question. And the natural immunity and all things like that, it's always a matter of functionality as well.
And moving on to a more light-hearted segment of the podcast is that when we talk about eco farming, right? Now, many of us stay in very humble, of course, comfortable but yet humble flats here in Singapore. I really do want to know: can you do eco farming at home? Now, prelude to this whole thing, or just give background. Now, I'm trying to grow small little vegetables in my, you know, balcony out here, which is 2 square meters long. Okay. Oh, what a sorry excuse for a balcony is just hanging it out there and praying to God that something is going to pop out of the soil. Okay. I have no experience whatsoever. I'm trying, hopefully. But I did get one batch. And to be honest with you, whoever is listening out there, farm to table is no joke. If you can get it that fresh, to be honest, right? People say that vegetables don't taste like anything. Trust me, vegetables taste like something. When you get it that
Yes.
fresh, you're gonna taste it. Okay, so I've got some rosemary, some basil, some dwarven bok choy growing over there,
Yes.
and some spring onions
Amazing.
that I kind of go up there. So what was cool is that I love going down the rabbit hole of throwing coffee grounds and whatever in there just to put nitrogen in or whatever. But can someone, in case of a zombie apocalypse or anything like that, grow their own food and be
Yeah.
sustainable in their own balconies in silo? Is it possible?
Right. So, Edric, yours is a great example, right? Of all the things that you mentioned, you had bok choy, rosemary, basil, and some of these herbs, right? The question for me is not whether it's possible. I have a small garden at home. Like, I also live in a flat, and I literally tied together shoe racks to elevate it to the
Mm.
window.
Yeah, you
And
got to
I've
MacGyver your
grown
way
a
through.
bunch of things. Yeah, so I've grown a bunch of things like kale, ladyfingers, tomatoes, and things like that because a lot of us who first start farming at home, we are drawn to things like herbs, right? We're drawn to things that are easy to grow in excess and abundance, but they don't actually make up too much of your plate, if you see what I mean. You might take
Mm.
rosemary, united basil, put it into your like marinade and things like that. And the question is, how much does it take for you to grow everything you need on your dinner table, right? To be
Yeah.
self-reliant. And I think that's a very good question to see Singapore as a microcosm, right? A lot of this conversation that got started, comes from the 30 by 30, right? 30 by 30 is
Mm.
producing 30% of our local nutritional needs by 2030. And 30% actually for the Singapore Food Agency constitutes local greens, leafy greens, eggs, and fish. But if you think about all of us, right, do we only eat leafy greens, eggs, and fish, right? There's so much of our diet that is not encompassed there. So what happens to the other 70%, right? That's my question. Where's that 70%? Are you able to grow rice at home? Are you able to grow potatoes? Are you able to grow your carbs? Are you able to grow your protein? Um, it's very hard. It's very, very hard, right? And that's no one's fault, but the fact that we live in a very, very highly urban environment, and we rely on other sources to get most of our food plate. So it's great to grow as much as possible, but I think what we will notice is that most of what we can grow at home in our little homes is supplementary. It is very, very
Mm.
supplementary, right? You could grow, and it's thinking about the human cycle of eating. If you're someone who eats salad 3 times a week, right? Are you able to have enough space to have lettuce growing up that you can harvest every 3 days and it gives you a continuous supply? It's very difficult, right? And I think that's the idea: is that you realize that farming at home gives you a project to work on, but then you're someone who eats every day, right? And everyone eats every day. So I think that's always the central dilemma, and you realize that farming takes on a very different dimension when you need to factor in things like growth cycles, when you need to factor in sort of the longevity of that food, right? If your farmer decides to stop working one day, it's not just one day gets affected, right? The whole year gets affected. So I think that's something that we don't quite see from farming at home. But it's great. I think growing as much as you can, you get that appreciation, like that much appreciation for people who do grow your food.
Okay. And let's just assume here that food security was completely out the window and we needed to start a project ASAP. All right, it's kind of like, uh, humans need to be shot into space if we don't do this. Okay, everybody in your flat needs to chip in. How would you arrange them to go, okay, look, we need to grow everything on our own, if not we're all gonna die. Now what are we
Yes.
gonna do now? How would you organize the people in your flat and all your residents to be able to get something sustainable in X number of months?
No, yeah, I think that's a very good question. So let's say you have a block of flats that has, let's say, 15 floors, right? The
Mhm.
first 4 to 5 floors should be growing things like sweet potatoes, cassava, and some rice. You can grow rice in Singapore. And then I've
Why
seen,
first 5 floors?
so as you have to ration the rest of the building, right? So you
Right.
do sweet
Okay.
potatoes, cassava, and then you need some things like tubers, right? So you do things like carrots, tomato. The top floors actually should be the ones who have access to more sunlight. The rooftop, you should grow your fruiting crops, things like tomatoes, peppers, gourds, cucumbers, right? And fruit if you have space, that's great. Every other floor, you divide it equally between things like herbs and leafy greens, and it has to be rationed out like that. And each floor needs to sort of do that batch phasing, right? So that every week you can harvest a little bit, harvest a little bit, harvest a little bit. Yeah, so that's how I would do it. Lah. I think,
Okay. So
Singapore's
everybody start.
yeah,
Mm.
so if you do have access to a rooftop space, grow the most sunlight intensive crops, right? All your fruiting crops, your fruits, your tomatoes, your cucumbers. Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard it here, all right, exclusively on the Epic podcast that in the event of a zombie apocalypse or if the world is in danger, grab a sickle and a shovel and look for Jolene. She's going to teach you how
I
to
think we
survive.
shouldn't do it. We shouldn't do it only in a zombie apocalypse, right? So recently, I was just thinking about a thought experiment with my friends. I was like, what if 2 years of NS in Singapore could just be a whole nation of 18-year-old boys farming, right, and volunteering their time to farm? I think that's a fantastic way of rethinking food, and for our boys to men to think about how much effort goes into your food. I think that's a very important part of security.
It is very true. It is very, very true. I mean, if you can take all of us in terms of those 18-year-old males, right, going out to the field, digging up trenches, living in the dirt, I don't see what's the difference of us and the Martian making poo potatoes.
Exactly. And it actually is a very, very good talent development pathway for the agricultural industry, because a lot of young people now, they say they want to lead a different life, not be stuck in a 9 to 5. But then when they actually come into an operationally intense job, they're like, oh, this is not for me.
Which is very true. Blue collar is the new white collar. You have to be able to roll up your sleeves, get dirty, right, and do a menial labor job if you have to. And interestingly enough, many high-profile individuals, right, or C levels, after they're done with their leadership tours and all this and their tenures, I ask them, what is it that you want to retire to do? By and large, I actually hear, I just want to tend to my farm. I want to have land in Vietnam to grow my own crops and vegetables. Farming now not just becomes sustainability, but it's sustainability of the mind and the spirit as well.
Yes, of
How
course.
different is that?
Yeah, no, it's really refreshing, but I think that also comes from the loneliness and desire for nature after living in a city for a long time.
Moving forward, what plans, if let's say you were given, if you had the choice to lead the 30 by 30 kind of initiative, right? What would you do as number one to tell all the citizens to do if it were mandatory to get to 30 by 30 faster?
Hmm. It's interesting. I think a lot of my efforts, if I had a choice, would actually be supporting the farmers, and helping them produce good quality produce that is affordable for the people. Because at the end of the day, for a lot of us, food is still a decision we make based on price. So you can't reverse engineer the system, right? You can't make the consumer sort of like, oh, we need to educate the consumer, then expect them to pay more, and then sort of like the quality that you get. Some people still go like, hey, how come I buy the $2 bok choy from Malaysia, it still tastes better than the one I'm buying from a Singaporean farm? That can't be the case. I think it's having people take pride in what's being grown here because it's actually good. And we have a very nascent urban farming landscape. So I think that's one thing. It's really giving the resources to the farms to be able to do the best work that they can do, and then sort of organically have people appreciate the quality, appreciate the freshness, because that's what you get with leafy greens and a lot of the produce, right? Is that when people taste the difference, it's because it's fresh. When you go to the supermarket and buy a packet of bok choy from Singapore and a packet of bok choy from Malaysia, you choose to pay less and take the one from Malaysia because there's no differentiation, right? The products are undifferentiated. You would rather just buy on the basis of price. But when you're able to actually give people good quality and for them to have something to be proud of, lah, right? I think that's really when you get a difference. You start a movement of people wanting to be connected to the best food that's grown here.
When it comes to Urban Tiller and your entire journey so far, right? What are you proud of?
Wow. I don't think I can say I'm proud of anything, really. Aside from really, really trying to, I think as a startup, like all the odds are stacked against you. And what I've tried to do as much as possible was to not deviate from the original value proposition, and to take care of my people as best as possible, no matter how difficult it is. I don't think I've done 100% a perfect job, but I've tried lah. I think that's what that's what I can be. I can say that I've been trying to do to my best of abilities.
Yeah, every day we keep learning, we keep growing.
Yeah, I think being a COVID startup is really just it's a different set of challenges, right? Everyone's life is in midair. You hire a team, and then they thought their lives were on hold. Maybe they had different plans, and there are so many uncertainties when it comes to just national policy around COVID, and there's always ups and downs that you have to just roll with the punches for that.
Yeah, you lead with courage and vulnerability.
I hope so. I hope
Yes.
so.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks, Jolene, so much for spending almost an hour with us. Now, there's always one last segment that we do in every podcast with our guests, and that is a rapid fire 10-question session known as the EPIC Questionnaire. So, with that, Jolene Lum, are you ready?
I have no idea what this is, but yes.
Okay, let's go. Question number 1. One word that you love the most.
Kale?
All right, that works. One word that you dislike the most.
Onions.
If you could have a conversation with one person, fictional, non-fictional, dead or alive, who would that be?
Probably my grandfather.
And what do you say to yourself every morning in front of the mirror?
The kale is going to be good today.
You really love kale. Okay. Name one superpower that you'd like to have.
Teleportation.
Why?
Just, you can't afford to be in places more than one at a time. And traveling takes a lot of time.
Okay. Favorite dish to eat?
Fried chicken. Sorry.
See, this is the irony here. As much as we love fresh produce, right? Nothing gets away from fried chicken.
It's true.
I just don't know why. There's something so wonderful about fried chicken that it just trumps everything else. Question number 7. Favorite travel spot or the next travel spot that you'd like to go to once borders open up?
I have always loved Slovenia, and I would love to go back. I went to school in Europe near the Slovene border, and if you ever gave me a choice, I would always go back to Slovenia.
Question 8. Something in the arts that you've always wanted to do but yet to do so.
Juggle.
Juggle.
Yeah, I see it as a fantastic art form. I just do not have the coordination for it.
Question number 9. What does retirement look like to you?
Probably either working on a small farm, or making bread in a cafe. Yeah, making bread day after day.
You enjoy making bread?
Yes, I think it's a very, very therapeutic activity.
All right, cool. And last question. How do you want to be remembered? What's your legacy?
Okay lah, she tried lah. Yeah, she tried. I think that's nice. That's the best one.
I really like that. Okay lah, she tried lah. So grandmotherly. It's okay.
I know.
She tried. It's okay. It's okay.
I think it's
All
comforting
right.
on every level.
Yeah, so good. And just cover yourself in a blanket of kale after that. All
Yes,
right.
and
So
nutrition.
with that, that was the epic questionnaire. And ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you so much to Jolene, the CEO and founder over at Urban Tiller Singapore. Now, again, if you are very, very interested, okay, in getting farm to table produce, go down to urbantiller.sg, get your orders in right now. And not only that, also follow them at Urban Tiller SG for some amazing recipes. Visit the website for great blog, great ideas of what you can do, or and maybe you could submit also what you shouldn't do, just to make it fun for them as well. Okay,
Okay.
and you know, for them it's one thing, but for me, do me a favor as well. Like, comment, and subscribe to at Epic Podcasting. Leave a comment below, and if you're watching this right now, leave a comment, or if you want to listen to the full version of this, go on to Spotify or anywhere else you got your podcast, where we've got an audio version for you as well. With that, all right, ladies and gentlemen, it's me. I'm Edric, and that I keep pointing the wrong way. Now that's Jolene over there from Urban Tiller. We will see you next week. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye bye.
Okay.